they were kind of, they fell under the ban hammer a little bit in YouTube. So if you're trying to follow along on YouTube, you may or may not have seen them. But they should be both up by now. So if you haven't seen the past two or listened to the past two, feel free to go to YouTube or Facebook, or maybe even ask me for the MP3s. MP3s are much better than video for this sort of thing. But so far, most people prefer to seem to watch this on video. Anyway, carrying on, I have a couple of clips I've collected over the course of the week. I have so much audio and video coming at me from so many different directions. It's hard to choose sometimes, but I did pick a couple that hopefully you will enjoy. And so I want to get right into that. And the first clip is going to be, if I'm pronouncing it right, Kimiko Ishizaka, who is a wonderful pianist. She has performed and recorded a whole bunch of the works of Johann Sebastian Bach, which is kind of near to my heart. She does a masterful job of it, and bonus, she releases it all to the Creative Commons. So the whole world can enjoy Johann Sebastian Bach as it was kind of perhaps meant to be heard, or at least done by someone with a clear mastery over her art. And so here is the BWV 847, Fugue number 2 in C minor. So hopefully that came through okay. I'm half tempted to just kind of leave that whole album on loop through this whole broadcast. Apparently it was kind of a social faux pas in the 1980s to read the news over classical music. It was some kind of sacrilegious activity to do that. So I'm kind of tempted to just do it anyway. But I think for this particular broadcast, I will not. But maybe we'll try that in the future. As I mentioned, there's a couple of other clips that I've kind of been collecting. I have continued to listen to The Voice of Long Island, which is one of the kind of precursor shows to the current show Off the Hook and Off the Wall, all out of New York. And as I'm slowly creeping through the archives, getting closer and closer to the date of my birth, there was a couple of interesting clips. One in particular, I didn't catch the guy's name right before the show. I'll try to track that down in the clip. But it's the former music columnist for The Village Voice, which I think is now, as of this year, shut down in New York, or near shutdown or something like that. Used to be a newspaper or some kind of magazine that you could read about what's going on in I guess, the New York area. But what was interesting about him is he had been the kind of music critic, or the guy writing reviews about music right from the early days of rock and roll through the 1980s. And so he had a huge, long experience and exposure to all the happenings in the record industry and the music industry as it went through some pretty crazy times. And so he had a couple interesting things to say. I just took out a little clip of this, so hopefully this is qualifying for fair use or something here. But I find his particular experience interesting in terms of how things have changed, not just since then, but since the early days. So let's just play this clip and see how he describes it.
What do you see as the role of college radio?
Well, college radio has become what we used to call progressive radio, hasn't it? I mean, it's what there is. And it's unfortunate that it usually has about 50 watts if it's lucky. So that it doesn't have the kind of spread and reach that you like radio to have. But on the other hand, it's really come up in the world. It's the only place where anybody who's interested in hearing the music can count on hearing it. That's not to say that stations like BCN and MMS in Cleveland, and even our own NEW don't do some of that. Mm-hmm. But they don't do enough.
This is where the tape cuts.
BCN and MMS in Cleveland, and even our own NEW don't do some of that. Mm-hmm. But they don't do enough. And for the most part, they see what's happened is that taste in popular music has really become so homogenized that most of it's like 1953 all over again. REO Speedwagon is like nothing so much as Doris Day. That's what it's like.
Write that one
it's
down.
The same kind of, the same sense of spiritual outreach and adventure, right? Has all that stuff.
But still, a difference from 1953. You didn't have any dictators in 1953 or anything. There was just so much that you can possibly find that's out today.
Well, yes, indeed. It's a very big difference. So I'm talking about what's on the charts, what the popular music is. Yeah, what I say in the introduction to my book is that where the action is in what I call semi-popular music, which is music which is based on popular forms but doesn't necessarily sell very much. Doesn't mean it doesn't sell. Often the good stuff, even today, does sell a fair amount. But hell, a lot of it just doesn't sell at all. And that doesn't mean it isn't good. That's called aesthetics or criticism or something like that.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, I mean, and the fact that rock and roll happened in 1954 and 5 is eventually what produced this enormous profusion of genres and independent record companies and audiences and markets too. I mean, because what's interesting is that all these little record companies that now exist that put out records, almost none of which existed even 5 years ago, they manage to sort of keep their heads above water because they love what they're doing. They don't have big financial needs themselves. And because there are enough people out there to do the buying. It's, I think in that kind of sense, it's actually a very healthy time in popular music. But I got into rock and roll because I was interested in mass culture and popular culture. I was interested in seeing the world change, and the world doesn't seem to be changing, at least not in any way that I like very much.
Uh-huh.
That's different.
Well, we had
So that was just a little clip of that interview. It's a much longer interview, and it talks a lot more about his book, which is kind of a review of a lot of the music of, I think it was the 1970s. So this is coming in like right in the early 80s. So there had already been some music in the 80s that he mentioned but didn't really go into. But there's a couple of things that kind of came out of that for me. One is, well, first of all, it's recorded on tape. And so you can hear as the end of the one tape happens and the beginning of the second tape, which caught a little bit of the kind of a repeat, as they probably started the second tape before the first one ended to make sure that it didn't get lost. It's always interesting hearing little artifacts like that from the past technology, because those of you out there who are younger may not remember that there were such tapes being made, and that was how audio was recorded back then. And then secondly, Doris Day, that's, I mean, a little bit before my time, but it's interesting that she's still in the news as of, I think, this past couple of weeks. Maybe it was that she died. I don't know. One of the two. But that was kind of an interesting name to drop out there. The third thing was that he's talking about how people encountered new music. And these college radio stations that had a very small reach, that you could probably hear on the campus, probably in the surrounding neighborhoods, but not that much further out. Maybe a little bit in the cities that they were in, but you were kind of extremely limited in terms of your geographical area of where you would be able to listen to new music as it came out. Again, this is a little bit before my time, but not that much more. It was still a problem when I was young, that there was really not all that many radio stations. I remember that. I do remember the really limited choice of music. And so pop music was probably as close as you get to the vast cornucopia of stuff we have today, unless you were involved in your local university or college, or had the connections to get the Pink Floyd or whatever. So that would be them kind of complaining about how homogenized music, other than the stuff you could get at college radio stations and these quote unquote progressive stations, was back then. And oh my God, it was so much more varied. Just listening to the archives and the Voice of Long Island. And I know they have like a little bit of a bias towards the interesting and kind of avant-garde stuff, but there's so much more going on back then compared to when I grew up, and compared to especially today, where you turn on the radio, you get the same stuff overplayed over and over and over again. You go to the bar, you're expected to play your AC/DC, your covers of the classic rock, et cetera, et cetera. There's just so much more that was going on in the 80s that I think is at risk of being forgotten entirely because of copyright and because of our restrictions on being able to replay it and being able to go back and share it anew. It still exists. A lot of it does, but some of it I think is starting to get lost. And there is, all these records and all this vinyl and all this stuff that's hard to get access to, that is still there, but it's just, at risk of being lost, and at risk of that one copy of that one cool record that only one community or one college radio station knew about or shared, or was popular in that one region. It didn't make it into the national scene. It didn't make it to the international scene to be remembered by this sort of permanent collective memory of libraries, et cetera. There is that loss of the diversity that is currently taking place. And we'll talk a little bit more about copyright later. But there was that they were kind of talking about. And it's interesting, especially that they talk about how small the record companies were, and how none of them, or at least the ones he's talking about, none of them existed only 5 years before that recording. So this is like over the course of almost an undergraduate degree, high school, going from the beginning to the end of high school, and it's such a small period of time to build something that would eventually become so powerful and so able to influence international law, international policy, trade policy, and the most private details of our lives, from just very, very humble beginnings that were about having fun and doing something cool with music, and making something that they could give to people who clearly had a want for it and had a need for it. And so there was this kind of really, really small beginning. So it's worth pointing out that, because these are human institutions. They were created by human hands, and they all started small. They all, I don't know if they started in garages or something that small, but you can imagine the Disney or Disney's gobbled up so much, smaller media companies by now. But again, you look at each one of those companies, they all started with a single human being going, hey, I want to start a company. And so it's worth going back and seeing that, because again, just because they're big and powerful now doesn't mean they're permanent. And it doesn't mean that they've always been around, and that this is the way we have our media landscape set up today is the way things have always been. This started at one point, and that recording, that what you just heard, is just an echo from that past, an echo from that point in history where it was still possible to do different things, where this war on users, on music lovers, hadn't started, wasn't even conceivable. Why would a small, what is a Scrap Apple company target their own consumers? It wouldn't have even been describable how that would even happen without some of the kind of later developments. And so that I did want to play and get kind of through. There is a couple more little clips I found that were kind of interesting before I want to get into some current events. This would, let's see what's going to be the next one here. Oh yeah, this one is a short media clip from a much longer documentary that is probably banned on Facebook. So if anything's going to get me trouble on Facebook, this is going to be the clip. But there are, it is small, so hopefully it's small enough to pass for criticism and discussion of the news involved. But let's just play it here.
We've all witnessed the confrontations over the past few days. At times it's hard to tell whether police are protecting citizens or threatening them. When two apparent good Samaritans stop to help a fallen woman, they all get pepper sprayed. Even media members weren't spared.
There's any more than 3 or 4 people on the street together. They suspended our right to gather together on the street. The Constitution's been suspended in Seattle today. These people were doing absolutely nothing.
Nobody was directly confronting the police. No one laid hands on anybody. Nobody touched property. And they were arrested anyway solely because the WTO comes to town. China and other foreign governments wander in here, and they've suspended our Constitution, supposedly the greatest democracy in the country. And now they're gassing everybody. What did you see here? Did you see any violence?
In downtown Seattle today, the First Amendment ended at 4th and Spring.
Are you part of an organized protest today?
Not only could you not say what's on your mind, you couldn't wear it.
Yeah, sir, let's not get into a big scuffle over here.
This man had an anti-WTO sticker on his backpack.
He took it off my right. You're not protest down here. You saw what happened yesterday to your city. We're not going to let it happen again, okay? Not allowed to have a sticker. Not here.
These officers stand guard at just one corner of a 50-block no-protest zone in downtown Seattle. Since a civil emergency was declared, talk of free speech, at least past this point,
It's a no protest zone, sir.
became moot.
You just took his gun, am I right? He did. He reached onto his body and pulled it right out. I asked if I could go through. He said, I couldn't if I had a button, and I wasn't going through the line, and then he ripped it off my jacket.
Now, if I say I'm protesting WTO, I can't do it. If my T-shirt said I supported the WTO, could I go in? That's not a protest.
It's a no protest zone, hence no protest.
Backpacks and bags were also searched for banners or gas masks.
Gas masks are illegal to possess today in the city of Seattle. If you get your what's that?
Just curious, how can you mandate something
Because
like
they
that?
declared the city a state of emergency.
But you don't know what thoughts are in my head, right?
I have no idea. Are you protesting? Are you protesting? There's no protest zone down there. You go down there and protest, you risk arrest. Okay? I'm just telling you that. You understand that? Okay.
What country is this?
It's a situation that is clearly uncomfortable for those who want to get through to protest and those who block their way.
What we're trying to do is keep protesters out and the business people and citizens go in, okay?
City leaders believe the free speech of yesterday came at too high a cost. That's why, at least for today, the First Amendment ended.
And hopefully that sound came through okay, like the previous clip. So I wanted to play this little clip because it is from when the WTO came to Seattle, the big battle of Seattle, on, I believe, the second day after the first kind of wave of Black Bloc protests. And it is from the documentary, the Alex Jones documentary. Ooh, scary Alex Jones. let's see, I think it's Prison 2000, or probably some Y2K or pre-Y2K documentary, which is it's interesting because it's before the internet was kind of really big, but it's after, again, the WTO, so it's kind of that interesting period in history. But I wanted to kind of play it because of a couple of things. It's hard to imagine without the video, or this picture of police kind of surrounding people, forcing them to not be able to go into a downtown core of a city, very similar to what happened in Toronto with the G20, very similar to what happened in Quebec during the Summer of the Americas, in more than a couple of places since. That was one place where these things happened, but it was captured on camera. And it was captured not just by bigger media, like that particular reporter so captured in Alex Jones's documentary, but also by smaller, more independent people who were trying to weave their own narrative, spin their own yarn, and make their own story that fit the facts better, perhaps, than the establishment press. And so the, quote, state of emergency where, quote, the First Amendment was ended, that is, of course, not really supposed to happen in the United States at all. The government of the United States is bound to be restricted at all times by the restrictions in its U.S. or in its Constitution. That is how things are supposed to work down there. So it's interesting that they use that very explicit language, that the First Amendment of their own Constitution, that gives their government their right to exist, even is suspended in a city as large as Seattle, even for that short period of time. It's also interesting that they point out that this is done at the behest of foreign governments. So this, of course, isn't unique to the United States. It is forgivable at the time to have them see things this way, because they were kind of the first to be reporting on it. But it isn't, all the foreign governments when it happens in the United States, and then it happens in Canada, and then it happens in Mexico, and then it happens in Canada again, and then it happens, similar things in other countries as well. If you start to look at the pattern of what is happening there, it ceases to be, oh, my country is under attack from all these other countries. And you start to see the bigger picture, the kind of Copernican flip that happens, where you start to see, oh, hey, it isn't just our government against, or our people against every other group of people. There's something more complicated going on here. And so when they made this no protest zone, and they made the similar zones in Toronto during the G20 and elsewhere, and eventually turned the entire country of Canada into an effective no protest zone with C-51. This is a progress that once you start going down that line, the consequences, it becomes easier and easier and easier to go to the next step. And when you lose that right to protest, when you lose that right to peacefully express your discontent in a public way, it gets harder for other people to know that your voice would be against what's happening. And so other people may expect that, oh, hey, well, because I'm the only one who feels this way, I'm the only one who hears the danger, it seems obvious to me, but maybe there's something wrong with me, because I am, if I speak out, no one will hear me because it's illegal, but there's no one else speaking out, so there's no one else who would support me in that. And that's where, when you're stuck in that kind of thinking, it becomes so much easier to just shut up and to not voice your discontent, and to just not be heard, and for the next step in taking away our freedoms to occur. And with that in mind, that is what I want to lead in to the news this week. So the news this week is the European Parliament adopted their copyright directive. And in particular, their Article 11 and Article 13 of that directive were passed. And I heard a little bit of rumors that they were watered down a little. So for example, it may not have completely outlawed free software and the Creative Commons. However, what was passed was bad enough. So let's go into some of these links here, some of the details. And some of this I just sort of skimmed because the kind of details aren't as important. Okay, this link didn't work at all. I must have copied it from somewhere else. What's going on here? There we go. But the important thing is this has been a campaign that has been going on for a long time. And the details were bad enough a long time ago that it is it has been fought at every step of the way. Hundreds of thousands of people came out to protest in free countries in Europe that are still free enough for them to do so, where they do not have protest-free zones of the entire country yet. But one of the ways that you can protest that has developed over the past couple of years is these pictures, these quote-unquote memes, political cartoons, things that are familiar, so your brain is able to process them at a higher level than just the picture themselves instantly, and be able to understand and share without putting too much thought into it. Now, should we be putting more critical thought into these particular pictures? Perhaps, but at the same time, outlawing them, outlawing the sharing of political ideas through a media is a dangerous, dangerous thing. And so we have, for example, this first one from InfoWars. Interesting, we have two Alex Jones stories here. Again, when we start talking about banning InfoWars, we lose this stuff. So it's important to keep that at least on the back burner somewhere. Quote, dark day for internet freedom. EU lawmakers approve controversial copyright reform. Just in, memes are now illegal. The European Parliament has voted to adopt a highly controversial Article 13, which would govern the production and distribution of content online under the auspices of increasing copyright protections. Tuesday's move will update the EU's 20-year-old copyright rules and will govern audiovisual content, much to the dismay of social media users who have already begun pouring their grief out online. So, and it shows this picture of a very, very sad frog. Quote, however, the Parliament said in a statement that sharing memes and GIFs has been protected, quote, even more than it was before, which is not actually as true as it may sound, quote, and they will continue to be available and shareable on online platforms. But, and here's the details, photography and pictures are going to be protected and restricted. And those same online platforms that are supposedly going to allow memes to continue to exist are mandated to put a filter in, a computer program that is going to A, see everything that is posted, and C, and be capable of transmitting that information back to players like the MI5, NSA, the French and German intelligence, never mind the Chinese intelligence, etc., and maybe corporate intelligence on top of that. But these filters have to be in place, that communities are given a period of time to exist without the filters to allow the creation of new communities, but they have to be put into place. And so these filters are then required to then censor for whatever purpose the government in the EU tells them to censor. And once these filters are in place, they will be used for things other than memes. They will be used for things other than merely sharing music in movies or whatever copyrighted material people are having their tizzy about right now. They will be used to silence, well, for starters, Nazis in Germany will be among the first to go. And, Nazis being silenced, maybe that's not a bad thing per se. But again, once that filter is in place, it will continue to be used for more and more things. And all it takes is one government in the EU to get into power, now that they have this filter that is going to be mandated to be in place, for all kinds of things to be censored and silenced, all kinds of ideas to just be filtered out of conversations Europe-wide. That has not been the case. That has not been thinkable, that the entirety of Europe could censor a single work like this in a long, long time. Going even as far back as the Cold War, you couldn't do that in the Cold War. The Russians wouldn't be able to censor something or wouldn't necessarily censor the things that the NATO bloc would. So there was always like two sides where one side could get access and one side couldn't. Usually it was the Soviet Union side and those behind the Iron Curtain who couldn't get access to things. And it was the people on our side in the free world who could. However, you have to go kind of even further back, decades and decades to anyone who would even try to have some level of authority over everything that everyone in Europe reads. And that person who tried that was Adolf Hitler. I am not exaggerating here, right? He was willing to do that. But who else in Europe's history has been willing to go that far? This is the extent that we are talking about. This is the lengths that Europe has enabled to be possible in the near and medium term future. Will this happen tomorrow? No. The individual countries have to vote on this. And so there is a place for these provisions to be blocked in places like Ireland, in places like the United Kingdom, in places possibly even like Scotland, to be honest, and Poland, and maybe even France. There's still some possible places where struggle against this can succeed. So not all hope is lost, but let's just go on to some of these other links before I get really started here. So there's that. We have one person asking, quote, what is, from Ray Marcus at niu.mo, what is going to be the fate of the Fediverse now that the EU is in favor of these copyright restrictions, Article 11 and Article 13? And that's a valid question. All these online services that are in our lives, from YouTube to Facebook to the Fediverse to everything where people congregate online, are now going to have to face this problem of, one, what do we do with this law? Two, what do we do with the difference between people in Europe versus not in Europe? Because companies like Facebook are so big that they have a lot of users in Europe, in the European Union. Millions, tens of millions. And so they are going to implement this. Facebook is not going to put up a struggle against this. And so that means that Facebook is going to have the code available to censor and silence people on the basis of copyright infringement enabled by default, and they're going to be required to have it. So even if the winds of change suddenly pick up in a country like Canada or the United States, and suddenly we have sane copyright laws that don't require this, they still are going to have that code ready to implement for the next government to take in office. So it's dangerous to have around on such a large scale. And for smaller websites, like individual Fediverse instances, they're not going to have the ability to choose whether or not they only target European users. They're going to A, block European users, B, block everyone who isn't in Europe, C, just have everyone get filtered. These are going to be the three easiest options, and people or different online services are going to take one of these options. So here's another kind of story on the same sort of lines, if it's going to load up for me. I think I actually have, here we go. From Slashdot, European governments approve controversial new copyright law. I like how everyone is calling this controversial, as if there's any controversy at all. It's fucking stupid. It is tremendously harmful to the culture, not just in Europe, but globally. It is tremendously harmful for the freedom of expression and freedom of association, not just in Europe, not just in the EU, but globally. This is no controversy here. This is a full-on attack on free culture, on the free societies, and democracy itself. So, quote, a controversial overhaul of Europe's copyright laws overcame a key hurdle Wednesday as majority of European governments signal support for the deal and set the stage for a pivotal vote by European Parliament expected to occur in March or April. Supporters of the legislation, and I think that was actually the vote that just went in their favor. The supporters of the legislation portrayed as a benign overhaul of copyright that will strengthen anti-piracy efforts. Opponents, on the other hand, warn that its most controversial provision, known as Article 13, would force internet platforms to adopt draconian filtering technologies. The cost to develop filtering technologies could be particularly burdensome to smaller companies, critics say. Again, this is not about smaller companies not being able to, put up with some small cost of enabling a totalitarian Europe-wide government to censor and silence what people say and think. Quote, online services have struggled to balance free speech and piracy for close to 2 decades. Faced with this difficult standoff, the authors of Article 13 have taken a rainbows and unicorns approach, promising stricter copyright enforcement, no wrongful takedowns, yeah, like that's going to happen, of legitimate content, and minimal burdens on smaller technology platforms. But it seems unlikely that any law can achieve all these objectives simultaneously, and digital rights groups suspect that the users will wind up getting burned, both due to wrongful takedowns of legitimate content and because of the burdens of mandatory filter will make it harder to start a new online hosting service. Yes, it will do both of those things, and far worse. Okay, so let's see what some of the comments were on this. There are some gooders. Quote, first person, Bob Strayo, 1, guess I'll need to find a way to block EU access to my servers. A large retainer for lawyers to issue copyright takedowns for any EU access to my comments on social media, which I own the copyright to. And then 3, a tax shelter for all that sweet, sweet profit, which is going to, again, just increase the profit of the lawyers to the detriment of everyone else. Okay. And quote, from Anonymous, quote, or just fucking link to them if you're in an EU country, which is a good point. This is one of the provisions that came out of these copyright provisions or articles is to criminalize linking. Now, linking is close to my heart because here in Canada, there was a court case that went all the way up from the smaller courts to the Supreme Court of Canada and was won by the person who was fighting for the right to hyperlink to material online, or at least for that right to be seen as an act of publishing, or of not publishing, rather. And so in Canada, I think it was Crooks versus Newton. I think it was 2011, SEC, something like that. I could probably grab the citation later. But again, there was a person who was defamed online, or someone said something bad about him. That was Wayne Crooks. And the thing in particular that people said bad about him was that his name was kind of, suggesting that he might be a crook, which is, again, kind of a lowball thing to say against someone. But a lot of people say insulting things to people on the internet. It's not a big deal. You just roll with it. He didn't. He started suing people in Canada to try to shut them up. And on top of that, he started suing people who hosted not just his comments or the comments about him, but comments linking to comments about him, and comments and posts linking to those comments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He sued Google, he sued Yahoo, he sued the public library where computers were able to access websites like Google and Yahoo. He sued everyone, or tried to. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court with one particular guy who ran a website, p2pnet.net, and p2pnet.net won. The Supreme Court of Canada saw that it was a harmless activity to say and write the words open bracket A space href equals quotation mark http : website here end quotation close bracket. This is a link open bracket /a close bracket. That is a hyperlink in practice. If you type that into a place that expects HTML, you will get a link to that website. And the Supreme Court of Canada saw that, and it was like, oh, well, this is no big deal. Lawyers do this all the time when they cite cases. That was explicitly mentioned as part of their rationale that, hey, you couldn't argue your rights as a lawyer or the rights of your client without the ability to refer to things. And in Europe, that is what they just outlawed. This free-willing ability to say something that refers to a second thing. And it sounds so absurd to even think of things in that term. that why would a government restrict your ability to talk about things, to refer to ideas and that have been thought of carefully before? Does this sound familiar from anywhere? Yes, it does. It sounds familiar because it's something right out of 1984. It is right out of the totalitarian playbook to forbid people to even be capable in language to express ideas that are contrary to the status quo, that are contrary to the government, that are contrary to the established order and the bureaucracy that runs it. That is what is going on in Europe right now. That is what is going on in the EU. That is what is wrong with these bills. And so let's see, go a little bit further here. We've got rights holders call for a suspension of Article 13. There's even the musicians and kind of prominent media industry people were in Europe were speaking out against this. This was not by all matters a handout to musicians, creators, movie makers, etc., because they know full well that this censorship is going to bite them in the ass too. Quote from torrentfreak.com, quote, companies are extremely worried about the current version of Article 13. They fear it will do more harm than good for their industries, and it may strengthen the position of major online content sharing service providers. In other words, big companies like Facebook and Google and Spotify are probably going to survive this. But all those smaller, well, all musicians and media producers and artists of all flavors will suddenly start to be beholden to what these platforms say is acceptable and the profit margins that these giant platforms say are mandatory. So, for example, Apple and their iTunes store and the, what is it, 20% cut that they take? And Spotify, same thing. It's like huge percentages of the cut that they take. And when we make these institutions more permanent, that's the kind of cut that goes up. That's the kind of profit that independent musicians won't make, because they will be restricted from being able to control their own prices in that way. Quote, according to the companies, the current proposals may actually be a step backwards. They specifically warn that the solutions that are under discussion are worse than the current legal framework. Quote, rather than rushing the highly controversial Article 13 and seeking conclusion of its provision, no matter the jeopardy to the European copyright framework and no matter the prejudice and damage to the creative sectors before the end of this legislative period, we urge the EU co-legislators to suspend negotiations with respect to this article, the companies write. The rights holders specifically mentioned a pending German case in which YouTube stands accused of being liable for the video's uploads of its users, which is, again, holding these platforms accountable for those filters of fail. Quote, the German federal court has referred several liability-related questions to the EU Court of Justice last summer, and rights holders hope that this will turn out in their favor. The Commission should continue to monitor the blah, blah, blah. Let's see, next thing. From Torrent Freak, EU Parliament adopts Copyright Directive, Article 13. The European Parliament has adopted the new Copyright Directive. Pause. This is actually another thing. This being able to read the news and to share news with people is another thing that these two articles restricts. So it restricts our ability to share true news, while of course not limiting fake news in any way whatsoever. This is going to tilt the battle of being able to be an informed citizen in a democracy against the citizens. So, continuing on. This includes widely contested Article 13, which is renumbered to Article 17 in the final text. Pirate Party MEP Julia Rita sees it as a dark day for internet freedom, but many copyright holders are happy with the result. Quote, in 2016, the Europeans first announced its plans to modernize copyright law. Initially, the plans received little mainstream attention, but over the past year, that changed drastically. Pause. This is the same thing that happened with the WIPO Copyright Treaty, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, ACTA, the EU Copyright Treaty with Canada. The major media that could be covering this tend to be major beneficiaries of restrictive copyright law. Bell, here in Canada, is a vertically integrated copyright monopoly. They control not just your internet and your telephone, but they also control the creation of the media and the rights to that media itself. So they have every intent of not talking about this until it is at all possible, or to avoid discussion of these issues. because it's in their interest to keep you in the dark, to keep you oblivious to the laws, not just here in Canada, but around the world, that could be forced onto Canada by act of treaty, which could very well be the next step. Continuing on. Opponents repeatedly warned that the former would lead to, quote, upload filters and censorship. The latter was framed as a link tax. So again, if you tax links, that's going to mean that you have control over them, you can reduce the amount of them, et cetera, et cetera. Continuing on. Quote, at the same time, many rights holder groups, publishers, and other members of the creative industry media embraced the proposals. They saw it as a much-needed lifeline to ensure fair remuneration on the internet, quote unquote. But we've already talked about why that isn't the case. It's not going to be fair. It's not going to be a better deal for creators because it's going to put more power in the hands of companies like Facebook and Google. Continuing on. Today, the European Parliament voted on the final text of the proposed directive. First up was a proposal to reject the entire copyright directive. This was rejected with 443 votes against and 181 in favor. A subsequent vote to allow amendments was also rejected, although it was very close with 317 in favor and 312 against. Parliament then moved on to vote on the entire decision. Comes to a major disappointment to Pirate Party MEP Julie Rita, who's been described as one of the most vocal opponents of the copyright directive. Earlier today, she urged her colleagues to reject the plans, and moments ago described the outcome of the vote as a dark day for internet freedom. We're going to go more into that later. Rita, who's the vice president of the Green/EFA group, says they will continue the fight against this new European law. And then Rita goes on and on a little bit. But as you can see, this is going to be, this is a huge deal. I'm focusing on it as much as I can this week because that's how big of a deal it is. Here, next article from Torrent Free, quote, anti-Article 13 petition signed by 5 million people. And the popular Save the Internet petition, which urges lawmakers to vote against Article 13 of the EU Copyright Directive, has reached a new milestone of 5 million signatures today. The petition is part of an intensifying campaign which also supports offline demonstration and Wikipedia blackouts. That's right. This affects Wikipedia because Wikipedia uses links to describe, just as a paper encyclopedia used to refer and cite its sources if it had sources to cite. Wikipedia cites its sources, and that is going to be a taxable and restrictable part of Wikipedia. So that means Wikipedia is going to have to put out some resources to implement these filters on what people can link to and how that's going to be handled in terms of the EU. But it's also going to mean that the EU is going to have some control over what they can and cannot link to, which is still hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. So, quote, with the final vote in European Copyright Directive coming up next week, campaigning efforts from both supporters and opponents are reaching new heights. Earlier this month, hundreds of organizations from the creative industries called on European Parliament to quickly adopt the proposals. These organizations were later followed by many individual creators. These supporters stress the planned copyright directive will help them protect their rights and get fair compensation. On the opposing side, there hasn't been any shortage of action either. Today, these, quote, Stop the Censorship Machinery, Save the Internet petition passed 5 million signatures, making it the largest to be hosted on the platform, which is change.org, which I'm just going to mention here. Change.org is behind the Great Cloud Wall. It is inaccessible to Tor users, so please don't use it if you can. And of course, so that means that all the Tor users weren't counted in Europe to this petition, but I'm sure they got that message anyway. Quote, petition is part of a broader campaign. It's been up for months, but this latest milestone will undoubtedly be used to convince members of the EU Parliament to reject Article 13 and Article 11 in the upcoming vote next Tuesday. Of course, it wasn't successful at that, but carrying on. Quote, several well-known digital rights groups have also launched Pledge 2019 campaign, encouraging people to contact their representatives. The German version of Wikipedia is going dark for 24 hours. Today, that was a couple of days ago, and was joined by the Slovak edition. There have been several demonstrations planned from around Europe, from Portugal all the way to Finland. Shows a map of all sorts of places in Europe. So that was going on. And then from the 29th, quote, France, again, from torrentfreak.com, France plans to add Article 13 to new anti-piracy law this summer. That's only a couple months away. That's really not that long from now. Quote, this week, European Parliament voted in favor of the new copyright directive. While the Council is yet to adopt it, France plans to implement the measures within months. Article 13/17 will be part of a new anti-piracy law that will also introduce a national blacklist of pirate streaming sites, the French Minister of Culture announced. Again, France and blacklists, those will not be the last websites to be put on such a blacklist. France will put other things on this list. Pornography will, of various kinds, will be put on the list for sure. But also things like the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests. They will almost certainly be put on such a list. And then, of course, means of getting around the list, similar to what we saw in Australia. Australia has a filter like that, or a blacklist like that. And same thing with Australia. Once the list is in place, once you have the capability to restrict what websites people can legally go to and technically go to, that list becomes a target for special interest groups that want their ideas or the ideas they don't like to not be available, even to criticize, to not be able to point to them, to not be able to link to them, to not be able to go to them, and to risk legal frustration if you are an internet service provider for not allowing this. This is dangerous ground we are treading on, and that the French are treading on here. Quote, while some MEPs state that they mistakenly pushed the wrong button on the close vote to allow changes to the text, the ultimate vote was clear. With 348 votes in favor, 274 against, and 36 abstentions, Parliament adopted the copyright directive unchanged. There's still a chance that negotiations could be reopened if the Council doesn't approve, but that's really the last straw. The French government, however, is done waiting and is moving full steam ahead. Quote, in a speech at the Series Mania Festival in Lille, French Minister of Culture Franck Riester described the outcome of the vote as a breakthrough, despite fierce protests. Europe stood tall and seized a historic opportunity to bring copyright into the digital age, he said. Yeah, the digital age being facilitated by our ability to link to things and to talk about things and to use computers for what we desire to use them for, instead of being restricted by our governments. Quote, despite intense and unprecedented pressure from the tech giants, despite massive campaigns of misinformation on social networks, Europe has held up well. Europe has not yielded. Europe has resisted, quote unquote. Of course, the misinformation campaigns came from predominantly the other side, but we'll just step over that. Talks about the renaming, quote, this is, in the future, YouTube will correctly compensate the creators whose works are broadcast on its platform, the minister added. Again, this is still in this mindset that ignores the whole existence of the Creative Commons and the struggle of people on YouTube to just engage with the Commons without kind of engaging with this other side of things. Quote, France could have implemented a similar legislation without Europe. However, the Minister of Culture stresses that a Europe-wide agreement is important. Large internet platforms can't circumvent that by simply blocking a single country. Well, they can block the entirety of Europe, but it's harder. Quote, with the backing from the European Parliament, France now plans to move forward without wasting any time. I want us to transpose the copyright directive and enter it into force as soon as possible, Riester noted. Most of the text will be transported into a new audiovisual law, an anti-piracy law which the government expects to present this summer. It includes Article 13/17. Under the article, many for-profit internet platforms are required to license content from copyright holders. If that is not possible, they have to ensure that infringing content is taken down and not re-uploaded to their services. In other words, if you try to appeal something, you're going to be going through a lot of trouble because it's going to be immediately banned, and you're going to have to appeal right to the top of the EU bureaucracy in order to get your legally publishable content online. If the technology involved says that you are a pirate, similar to my previous podcast, where even though I probably, or for one of my videos, I absolutely had a right to use the particular clip in question, the software didn't think so. and I had to fight a battle with Google software to be able to post something online. This is not the way the internet used to work. It used to be that if you posted something online, you would be able to, without this technical restriction on your being able to do so, being a primary and capable of silencing you without legal recourse. Quote, okay, that's enough of that one. Kind of goes on and on. So, let's see, there's a couple, actually there are a couple more links here. Let's just load them up. Just getting it. Okay. So one was talking about the protests. Let's see here. Why is this not loading? Okay. So one is from linked to by all three of these. I think are linked to by Dr. Roy Shestowitz, which is he's an endless source of interesting and good information. He is. It's hard to keep up with him. He posts so much. But he posted one link to fosspatents.com, which I can't remember the guy's name. He's been running this blog for a long time. That, quote, the Swedish government may have to vote against the copyright bill in the EU Council. Quote, the triply illegitimate European Parliament vote in copyright bill requiring upload filters. Quote, as the French government, its number one proponent, has stated clearly, the German EU commissioner, if I'm pronouncing this right, Gunther Oettinger, considers, quote, not entirely avoidable, should be repeated as Czech conservative MEP Thomas Zizowski formally proposes. But in any event, it's not yet a settled matter, as Mr. Oettinger, who initially came up with the ill-conceived proposal that led to this mess, just claimed in an interview in which he threatened sanctions against countries that might, quote, water down the text through implementation processes. So in other words, the EU is willing to put its full force of what it can do against any country in Europe that tries to get out of this and tries to stop it. That doesn't mean that they still can't try to stop it. And it doesn't mean that they even couldn't stop it at this point. But it just shows how serious they are about pushing this, how serious they are willing to go to make this into a mandatory restriction on what people can say and do online. Quote, the EU Council still has to formally adopt the bill, and since it's clearly irreconcilable with the German government coalition agreement, let's see what happens. So this was on the 29th. Let's see here. And it goes into a little bit of the details in Germany and Sweden, but there is hope in Germany and Sweden. There's the, quote, FII, which I forget what that stands for, and they're not, oh, here we go, Foundation for Free Information Infrastructure, another one of those kind of NGOs in Europe. Quote, FFII calls on national parliaments to reverse Soviet-style internet upload filters. I mean, calling them Soviet-style is a little bit of a stretch. Although the Soviet Union did have restrictions on the technology that allowed people to communicate and did implement a mass surveillance system, it was nowhere near as deeply and as thoroughly oppressive as the system that they just voted for in Europe. So let's go back to this. Quote, FFII is calling on angry protesters against internet upload filters to reverse the position of their country by calling for a vote in their national parliament. Council of Ministers is an undemocratic institution where decisions on this particular subject are made by officials of the member states' ministries of culture, i.e. not anyone necessarily beholden to the public. Quote, FFII calls on national parliaments to, quote, take back control. The adoption of internet upload filters is a strategic mistake that will fuel the Eurosceptics game at the coming elections. More on that in a bit. Boris Johnson's reaction to the European vote yesterday left no doubt about it. Internet upload filters are a slippery slope. Another directive will extend automatic filtering to terrorist content. More on that in another podcast. I'm not going to talk about the EU terrorist or anti-terror bill that's going down the pipes, but definitely more on that later. Quote, fake news and finally political speech. Where does it end? The Council of Ministers is expected to formally adopt the directive as an A item, presumably meaning sooner, at the next meeting on 9th of April. Benjamin Hurin, president of FII, says, quote, it's time for real European democracy. You have next week to change the outcome. Call your national parliament now and ask for a vote on internet upload filters. He remembers 15 years ago, Poland saved small and medium enterprises from harmful software patent directive. Any country can do it again. Merkel and Macron sold small and medium enterprises for a Russian gas pipeline. It's time to fix the European democratic deficit and replace diplomats by a network of national parliaments. Ministers of culture should not be allowed to dictate the position of a country. The CETA debate was the same undemocratic mess. It was barely discussed in 3 national parliaments out of 28. A few unelected ministers decided on positions of their countries. Internet companies are already looking to relocate in Switzerland to avoid the unsupportable liabilities created by the European filter net, similar to, again, the Great Firewall in China or the blacklists in Australia, in countries like Iran. I think I'm blanking other than Iran and China right now. But again, there are going to be countries outside of this still. We'll get more on that in a bit. Quote, and the copyright lobby is also pushing for Switzerland to copy-paste the same absurd legislation that small companies cannot comply with. He finishes, quote, Macron's dream of a French startup nation did not last long. His guiding principles appear to be leave business to big business. Okay, and then, quote, after yesterday's accidental vote, EU copyright bill faces 3 huge legitimacy issues, not counting lobbying and Putin's pipeline. Quote, again from FossPatents.com. The lesson from yesterday's European Parliament vote on copyright reform is that no one is ever beaten unless he gives up the fight. In fact, the vote was not just very close on whether or not to allow amendments, but it turns out we lost the vote on whether to proceed on votes to amendments because MEPs accidentally pushed the wrong button, resulting in an incorrect 317 to 312, quote, majority against outlawing amendments. More on this further below. Pause. It's also conceivable that a foreign government, like, for example, Canada, which has the legal ability to hack elections in foreign countries, as CSIS has the ability and technical ability to do, was at play here. I haven't seen any evidence of this, but it's conceivable, right, on something like this, that the media industries here might have that kind of hooked up. Anyway, continue. Going forward, there are actually some opportunities to derail or delay adoption of the directive by EU Council. Quote, by simply delaying adoption into the new EUJ legislative term, new procedural opportunities would arise, and it shouldn't be too hard to delay adoption of an incredibly unpopular measure during the hottest phase of the election campaign. And even if this didn't work out, the efforts going into this would highlight and underscore the illegitimacy and ill-conceived bill with a view to national adoption. Quote, it's not even like we'd have to create facts that delegitimize the bill. The facts are already there, out in the open, well-documented, indisputable, and incontrovertible. It's our job that as defendants of a reasonable, fit-for-the-future balance between traditional creativity and 21st century creativity to take those silver bullets and use them wisely, forcefully, and swiftly. So here are the 3 things. Quote, the European Parliament's decision to disallow the votes on individual amendments, the single most important one, which would have been an amendment resulting in the deletion of Article 13/17, resulted from a voting accident. So there's number 1. They talk about the confusion of the process, the technical process of voting. We don't know. The European Parliament, 2. The European Parliament as an institution wasn't neutral and fair. It published a propaganda video created by pro-Article 13 lobbyists. It's also questionable why, or at a minimum, rather uncommon that, the Parliament's administration allowed a wine and dine session by the, quote, Yes to Copyright campaign in the Parliament during a plenary session. So this is open corruption here. This is complete and open corruption that allowed this article to be passed. this is not how a functioning democracy enacts laws, where you have hundreds of thousands of people protesting on the streets and a wine and dine of lobbyists that actually get to have their bill passed. That is ridiculous. I mean, granted, I'm not a European, so that part, is kind of irrelevant to me. But again, if you're in Europe and you hear that, you should be pissed off. Quote, and this tweet by SaveYourInternet.eu campaign to a hashtag yes to copyright t-shirt at the entrance of the plenary also suggests a lack of impartiality, as does the fact that the President of Parliament declined to accept the petition. They declined to accept the petition, the largest Change.org petition in history, and they declined to accept it. Quote, signed by 5.1 million citizens. Then the third thing, quote, in Germany, what's a far bigger issue than the quote Putin connection, unquote, especially since there's obviously no reason to assume he'd want the EU to require upload filters, is that the CDU/CSU/SPD coalition agreement contained a commitment to avoid an upload filter requirement. Merkel and her Minister of Economic Affairs, Peter Altmaier, did a deal with France that was irreconcilable with the coalition agreement, and that's why the SPD, which distanced itself from the decision, can now be reasonably required to derail or at least delay the adoption of the bill by the EU Council. The breach of the coalition agreement gives us leverage against the SPD and gives the SPD leverage against the CDU/CSU. But if we don't leverage it, the SPD won't have any ammunition either. Quote. So in other words, there are little bits of hope still left. There are places, little levers that can be pulled if enough people in Europe get pissed off and start pulling them. But again, this is just a huge, huge thing. So it's worth pointing out, though, this is a problem for Canadians because, one, we use the platforms that Europeans use, Facebook, Google, and future things that had yet to be invented that could end Facebook and replace it, just like Facebook more or less replaced MySpace, and MySpace more or less replaced LiveJournal, and LiveJournal more or less replaced whatever LiveJournal replaced, right? These institutions will exist in the future, and Canadians and Europeans could be talking and sharing information and sharing culture and doing musical projects together if we wanted to do this. Or we can go down this route and have Europe dictate to Canadian citizens what we can say, what we can share, etc. And democracy itself is under threat here because this is restricting some of the basic processes. Journalism, being able to refer to things, being able to say things without being taxed on your speech, being able to share media and share political ideas. These are all directly under attack from these provisions. And without the ability to read, without the ability to write, there won't be any ability to read. So this is leading to basically a system of mandatory ignorance, the burning of history, because when you're not able to link to things, historical documents become harder to get, harder to research, harder to find, harder to reproduce, harder to bring up and to contextualize and to make meaningful. This will make them a lot easier to lose, make it a lot more difficult to run something like the Internet Archive in Europe, if not impossible. So history will be a grave under grave threat, and without the ability to freely read, with a forced system of ignorance and lack of history, there is really only one possible result of this. And I'm not saying it lightly when I say that is slavery. I can't recommend highly enough the Snowden and the Future lecture series by Moglen, who went into the details of why systems like this, why systems of mass surveillance and mandatory restriction on what we can say lead to that. And it's not an exaggeration to say that. That this, when you have a government, a bureaucracy that is as big as the European Union, that is as willing to censor speech across hundreds of millions of people, that is a oppressive system that is going to have us plunge headfirst into a dark age, and that this is risking the fracture of the fragile peace that has been fought for over decades to keep Europe as a single political entity. This is a very good reason for people in places like the United Kingdom to split off and form their own country that is no longer part of the European Union. They've already voted to do so once, and they're still moving in that direction. And this is exactly the reason why you as a person in the UK would not want to be part of the European Union. And so, the existence of the UK is tens, 100 million people that could be free from these restrictions if they choose to. They have the opportunity to do so. However, Julia Rita made the point that, at least according to her sources, the UK is going to vote for this to be passed into law, so that they're going to get basically a 2-for-1, where the United Kingdom is going to be able to complain about the EU and to get its own sense of independence from it, but they're not going to get any of the benefits from leaving the EU behind, because they're just going to enact the same thing there before it goes anyway to score political points. That doesn't have to happen. If enough people get out into the streets in the UK, that could still be stopped. But it is a lever for the people in the UK to do something about this and to build a resistance to this being pushed into the UK. But it's also worth pointing out that this spread of continental-wide oppression and being able to have voices silenced on a huge mass scale has happened before. And as I mentioned before, it happened with the Nazis. The Nazis tried to do this. They tried to push a system this oppressive into the entirety of Europe. But there was 2 other points in the past 200 years or so where this kind of restrictive, oppressive government tried to push to the edges of Europe in the way that the EU has done so. And that was the cause of the First World War and even the Napoleonic Wars. And although some of the details get a little bit different the further back in history you go, it is worth talking about the fact that the last 2 times that this sort of thing was attempted, it led to war. And it led to this fracture of this peace. It led to suffering on a tremendous scale. It led to a whole loss of generations of potential, of lives, of people's safety and psychological well-being, and all the horrors that come from this. This is what they are risking right now. This is when they build this oppressive system, when they build this ability to control people down to such a detailed level into their private lives. And when they build these systems of mass surveillance and make them so encoded that you can't remove them except by violence, that is going to be the consequence. And this is starting to be a danger in Europe right now, where the UK has every interest in breaking off and becoming independent, and every interest in challenging the EU's dominance in not just this area, but in others. And this is a really dangerous road that they are going down. So it is worth, if you're in Europe, doing a lot to stop it, to putting significant amounts of your resources into, one, getting the UK out of the European Union. So at least there's a single country that is free of that, that can be kind of not beholden to the bureaucrats in this way, and then can inspire further countries to break free, like Poland, and possibly even France, if the Yellow Jackets can get their shit together. And that would be, at least a couple of steps better than where we are. But it doesn't have to go into violence, but I fear that it is going in that direction, and that the darkness is spreading from Europe in a way that we really have not seen in my lifetime and in generations. And this is really a worrying trend. So anyway, enough about Article 13 in Europe and the troubles that are heading our way. This broadcast is available on YouTube, as you're probably watching on right now, but it's also going to be available on Facebook, as you're watching it right now, but it's also going to be available on YouTube when I get around to posting it. As well as, if you'd like the MP3 for it, you can ask me directly and I will give it to you. I do have MP3s for these shows, and I intend on posting them somewhere that will accept them and allow them to be downloaded with an RSS client or something. I just haven't gotten around to that yet. If you'd like to hear anything, maybe some description of something specific, some details of something I've talked about, send me what you'd like to hear via Ricochet. Ricochet address ricochet:/MSZIS N for Neptune, A, F for Foxtrot, 7, V for Victor, QQ, P for Penguin, H for Hotel, R for Romeo, D for Delta, all lowercase. And especially Creative Commons music. If you have any Creative Commons music and you'd like me to play, feel free to send it. I will try to play at least one song every week and give you guys an exposure to something that maybe, like I mentioned with the college radio stations in the 80s and the progressive radio stations in the 80s, maybe it's something you haven't been exposed to before, and might make your kind of life better by having access to that. If you've enjoyed this broadcast and you'd like to support it, you can do so with either Subscriber Star, Villages, or Bitcoin. The address will be posted on the YouTube link as I get to that. And to end this week's show, I'm going to try to play a little clip here, which is Julia Rita, which I mentioned a couple of times. And she is a member of the European Parliament and has been sticking up for what people would call internet rights, or just basic human rights, and has been the loudest voice for years now, and is doing a great job at, one, keeping the world informed what Europe is doing, and then two, actually doing things about the problematic legislation such as Article 13/17. So I have this YouTube video here, quote, Article 13, Virhand für die Netzer. Screw it. It's a long German title. Anyway, it's got her talking and it has subtitles. So I'm going to try reading the subtitles as I play this. So hopefully you get the kind of understanding of what she's saying in this little speech. So hopefully you enjoy. Hopefully it comes through okay. And that'll be it for today.
Meine Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen, there are three things about this copyright debate that are unprecedented. First of all, 200,000 people have demonstrated against this reform this weekend. 5 million have signed a petition against upload filters. Never has there been such a broad protest against an EU directive. Second of all, never have protests been ignored so thoroughly by the Parliament. Already last summer, voters were confronted with a massive disinformation campaign. Instead of engaging with their criticism, every critical voice was blanketed with insults. Rumors were spread, like from colleague Canvada just now, that emails came from bots. The EU Commission has called critics a mob. The head of the CDU delegation, Mr. Kasper, even claims that protesters were paid. All these defamations were purely fictional and easily disproven. And they were launched by a few lobby groups and spread in the opinion pages of certain newspapers who hoped to financially gain from copyright reform. Unfortunately, the disinformation campaign has worked. Today, as photos of the massive demonstrations are going around the world, some still believe that the emails didn't come from real people. The belief that all criticism was controlled from the US has inoculated them from engaging with the subject of their concerns. Regardless of the fact that the warnings or upload filters came from Germany's National Data Protection Officer or the UN Special Rapporteur for Free Speech and from leading research centers. Third of all, nobody, neither the CDU, nor the SPD, nor the opposition, believes in this reform. Nobody in Germany wants to take responsibility for the upload filters, which Article 13 will lead to. But the government will. Dear colleagues, I ask you, all of you had your time. I would like to hold my speech as well. Thank you. Dear Chair, I will wait until the colleagues have calmed down.
Excuse me, Madam Reda is... Herr Brock, bitte, please, Madam Reda has the floor. Respect the speaker who has the floor. Madam Reda, please continue. Thank you.
Nobody in the government wants to take responsibility for the upload filters. Not even Chancellor Merkel. But the government will vote for them anyway. And yesterday we learned why that might be. The newspaper FAZ has uncovered a horse trade between Germany and France, in which Germany seems to have accepted upload filters in exchange for France's agreement to the Nord Stream gas pipeline. The most tragic
Tragischste an
Excuse me,
diesem Vorgang ist...
Madam, I'm delighted you're all wide awake this morning, but please allow Madam Rader to continue speaking, and that's from both sides of the House. Madam Rader.
Meine Damen und Herren,
Ladies
das
and gentlemen,
Tragischste an
the
diesem
most
Vorgang
tragic thing about this
ist, eine neue
process, a new
Generation, die
generation,
dieses Jahr
were
zum
voting in
ersten
this
Mal
European
zur
elections for the
Europawahl
first
geht,
time.
lernt
This year are
gleiche
learning a
Lektion.
lesson.
Eure Proteste
Your
sind
protests
nichts
aren't
wert.
worth anything.
Die Politik wird
Politics will spread lies
Lügen
about
über
you
euch auskippen und sich von
and won't care for
Sachargumenten
factual
nicht
arguments
beeindrucken lassen, wenn es um
if
knallharte
geopolitical interests
geopolitische
are at stake.
Interessen geht. Diese
This
Erfahrung,
experience,
dieses Gefühl
this
von
feeling of
Machtlosigkeit wird sie
powerlessness
nachhaltig
will have a
prägen.
lasting
Liebe
impact.
Kolleginnen und
Dear
Kollegen,
colleagues,
so
this is
können
not
wir
how
nicht
we can
Politik
conduct
machen.
politics.
Diese Richtlinie
The
darf
directives
nicht
must
ohne
not be
Änderungen
adopted
durchkommen.
without
Das wäre
changes.
nicht nur verheerend
That
für
just
die
would
Freiheit
be,
im Netz,
or that would be
es würde auch
disastrous
einer
for online
ganzen
freedom.
Generation
And it would
das
also rob a
Vertrauen
whole
rauben,
generation of
dass die
trusted
Politik
politics
funktioniert und dass dieses
and that the
Parlament die
European
Interessen der
Thank you,
Bevölkerung vertritt.
represents the
Deshalb
interests of the
Madam
public.
Reda.
Artikel
That's
11
why
und
we need to
30
delete
streichen.
the Articles
Dankeschön.
11 and 13. Thank you.